They said he was too set in his ways to find love, but what Thomas Whitman really needed was someone who understood that a weathered heart could still bloom. The autumn wind swept across the Montana plains, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and the promise of snow, while Thomas stood on his porch watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. His calloused hands gripped the weathered railing, and for the 1000th time that year, he wondered if the silence would always be his only companion. The ranch stretched out before him like a testament to solitude, 2,000 acres of rolling hills and scattered cattle that had been his world for the past 15 years. At Fort 2, Thomas had built something substantial from nothing, but the satisfaction of ownership had long since faded into the routine of survival. His neighbors in Cedar Ridge whispered that he was married to his land, too stubborn and rough around the edges to make room for anything softer than leather and steel. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. But they had never seen Thomas in the early morning hours when the coffee grew cold in his cup as he stared at the empty chair across from him, or heard the way he spoke to his horses with a gentleness that would have surprised those who only knew his business dealings in town. The truth was that Thomas Whitman had been searching for love longer than he cared to admit, but his methods had always fallen short of his hopes. The idea of placing an advertisement for a mail-order bride had come to him during one particularly brutal winter when the isolation had pressed against him like a physical weight. He had written and rewritten the letter dozens of times, each attempt revealing more of his uncertainty than his confidence. How did a man describe himself honestly without admitting to the loneliness that had become his constant shadow? In the end, he had settled on simplicity. Rancher seeks companionship and partnership. Comfortable home, steady income, respectful treatment guaranteed. Looking for someone who understands that love grows slow but deep, like the roots of the cottonwoods by my creek. The response had come from a woman named Eleanor Hayes in Pennsylvania, and her letter had surprised him with its directness. She wrote of being 28 and unmarried, of feeling displaced in a world that seemed to have no use for women who preferred honest conversation to elaborate social games. Her penmanship was neat but not precious, her words careful but not calculated, and something in the rhythm of her sentences suggested a person who chose her thoughts as deliberately as Thomas chose his cattle. Their correspondence had continued for 6 months, letters crossing the vast distance between them like tentative bridges built one plank at a time. Eleanor wrote of her work as a seamstress, of books she had read, of her deceased parents who had raised her to value substance over appearance. Thomas found himself sharing details of ranch life he had never thought to tell anyone, the way the light fell differently on snow than on grass, the satisfaction of delivering a difficult calf, the particular silence that came just before dawn. When he finally wrote to ask if she would consider joining him in Montana, Thomas had stared at the sealed envelope for 3 days before riding to town to post it. The weeks that followed had stretched endlessly, filled with second-guessing and the growing certainty that no woman in her right mind would leave civilization for the uncertainties of frontier life with a man she had never met. Her acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in late September, and Thomas read it so many times the paper began to show where along the creases. Eleanor Hayes would arrive on the morning train the second week of October, bringing with her one trunk of belongings and what she described as reasonable expectations and an open heart. Now, as October's chills settled over the ranch, Thomas found himself alternating between anticipation and something that felt dangerously close to panic. He had spent the last week cleaning the house with an attention to detail that would have amused his hired hand, Jake Morrison, if the old cowboy had been inclined toward commentary on his employer's domestic efforts. The house itself was solid if not fancy, built from logs Thomas had cut and shaped himself during his first years on the land. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen large enough for more than one person to work comfortably, a sitting room with windows facing east toward the sunrise and west toward the mountains. He had added a covered porch the previous spring, thinking it might be pleasant to sit outside during the warmer months, though he had rarely taken the time to enjoy it himself. The morning of Eleanor's arrival dawned clear and cold, with frost painting intricate patterns on the windows and the horse's breath visible in white puffs as Thomas completed his usual chores. He had debated wearing his best clothes to meet the train, but settled instead on clean work clothes and his newer hat, reasoning that Eleanor should see exactly what kind of man she was getting rather than some polished version that could not be sustained. Cedar Ridge's train station consisted of little more than a wooden platform and a small building that served as both ticket office and waiting room, but Thomas arrived early enough to pace the length of the platform twice before forcing himself to stand still. Other townspeople moved about their business, some casting curious glances his way, and he realized that news of the mail-order bride had likely spread through the community faster than he would have preferred. The train's whistle echoed off the surrounding hills long before the engine came into view, and Thomas felt his heart begin to race in a way that reminded him of his first cattle drive. That mixture of excitement and terror that came with stepping into something entirely unknown. Steam and smoke announced the train's arrival, and as it ground to a halt with a great hissing of brakes, Thomas searched the windows for a face that might belong to the woman whose letters had become the bright spots in his isolated weeks. Eleanor Hayes stepped down from the passenger car with a careful dignity that immediately distinguished her from the casual travelers who followed. She was neither tall nor short, neither beautiful in the conventional sense nor plain, but there was something in her bearing that suggested inner strength wrapped in outward composure. Her traveling dress was well made but not elaborate, a deep blue wool that complemented her dark hair, which she wore pulled back in a style that was practical rather than fashionable. Her eyes, Thomas noticed as she looked around the platform, were the color of winter sky, gray-blue and serious, and when they found his face, he saw in them the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that he felt in his own chest. She carried herself like someone who had learned to rely on her own judgment, but the slight tightening around her eyes suggested that even the most independent person could feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of leaving everything familiar behind. "Mr. Whitman?" Her voice carried the slight accent of the East, but it was warm rather than affected, and when Thomas nodded, she extended a gloved hand with the same straightforward manner that had characterized her letters. "I am Eleanor Hayes. Thank you for meeting me." Thomas removed his hat as he took her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip and the way her direct gaze neither challenged nor submitted but simply acknowledged him as an equal. "Miss Hayes, I hope the journey was not too difficult. Long, but not unpleasant. I had time to think, which I suppose was necessary." She glanced around the small station, taking in the rough-hewn buildings and the vast sky that stretched in all directions. "It is very different from Pennsylvania." Different how? Thomas found himself genuinely curious about her first impressions, though he had lived with the landscape so long he rarely saw it through fresh eyes. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her words carried a note of something that might have been wonder. Larger. More. Honest, perhaps. There is no pretense in a sky that wide. The observation pleased Thomas more than he expected, suggesting that Eleanor might see in the harsh beauty of Montana something of what had kept him anchored to this place through all the lonely years. He collected her trunk from the baggage car, noting that it was substantial but not excessive, practical rather than ostentatious, which aligned with everything else he had learned about her character. The ride back to the ranch gave them both time to adjust to the reality of each other's presence after months of existing only as words on paper. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon seat with the same composed alertness she had shown on the platform, asking questions about the land and the town that showed genuine interest rather than polite conversation. "How long have you been here?" she asked as they passed a grove of cottonwoods whose leaves had turned golden in the autumn light. 15 years this spring. Came out with nothing but determination and enough money for a down payment on the land." Thomas found himself speaking more easily than he had expected, perhaps because Eleanor listened with the same attention she brought to everything else. "Built the house the first year, added to the herd gradually. It has been good to me, mostly." Mostly? Thomas considered how to answer without sounding self-pitying or desperate. "The land provides well enough, but it can be a solitary life. I suppose that is why I wrote to you." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, and Thomas appreciated that she did not rush to fill the silence with reassurances or questions. Instead, she seemed to be absorbing the implications of his words, weighing them against her own reasons for making this journey. "I understand solitude," she said finally, "though mine was different from yours. Surrounded by people who never really saw me, rather than alone with the space to be myself." The honesty of her response surprised Thomas, and he glanced at her profile as she gazed across the rolling hills. There was something in her expression that suggested she had given considerable thought to the nature of loneliness, and he wondered what circumstances had shaped her understanding. As they approached the ranch, Thomas found himself seeing it through Eleanor's eyes, noting details that had become invisible through familiarity. The house sat in a natural depression that provided some shelter from the wind, surrounded by the cottonwoods that grew along the creek. The barn and other outbuildings were well maintained but clearly functional rather than decorative, and the corrals held a dozen horses that lifted their heads curiously at the approaching wagon. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said, and Thomas heard genuine appreciation in her voice rather than polite approval. "The way it sits with the land instead of imposing on it. You built this with respect for what was already here." Her observation revealed an understanding that Thomas had never heard expressed so clearly, and he felt something ease in his chest that he had not realized was tense. Perhaps Eleanor Hayes might indeed be someone who could see past the surface of things to their essential truth. The house showed the signs of Thomas's recent cleaning efforts, but Eleanor moved through it with the practical eye of someone who understood the difference between cleanliness and comfort. She examined the kitchen with particular attention, running her fingers along the solid wooden counters and testing the pump at the sink. "The water comes from the creek?" she asked, and when Thomas nodded, she smiled slightly. "I have always preferred well water to what they pipe into the city buildings. It tastes like the earth it comes from." Thomas showed her to the bedroom he had prepared for her, the smaller of the two but with windows facing east and south to catch the morning light. He had worried that it might seem too plain or small, but Eleanor examined it with the same methodical appreciation she had shown the rest of the house. "This will do very well," she said, setting her traveling bag on the dresser that Thomas had built himself from pine planks. "When do you typically eat your meals? I would like to establish a routine that works for both of us." The practical nature of her question relieved Thomas, who had been uncertain how to navigate the awkwardness of two strangers sharing a household. Over the next hour, they discussed the logistics of daily life, from cooking arrangements to the care of the house, and Thomas found himself impressed by Eleanor's ability to ask direct questions without seeming intrusive or demanding. "I brought some of my sewing supplies," Eleanor mentioned as she unpacked her trunk. "I thought perhaps I could take in some work from the town to contribute to the household expenses." That is not necessary, Thomas said quickly, then paused as he realized how his response might sound. I mean, I can provide for both of us comfortably. But if sewing is something you enjoy, I would not want to discourage it. Eleanor looked at him with that direct gaze that seemed to see more than most people bothered to look for. I prefer to contribute something beyond housekeeping, Mr. Whitman. Not because I doubt your ability to provide, but because I function better when I feel useful. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hooves in the yard, and Thomas went to the window to see Jake Morrison riding up to the house. The old cowboy had been Thomas's only hired hand for the past 5 years, a steady man whose discretion was matched only by his ability to judge character quickly and accurately. That would be Jake, Thomas explained to Eleanor. He helps with the cattle and horses. Good man, but not much for social conversation. Jake dismounted and approached the porch with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary hurry. He was perhaps 60, weathered by decades of outdoor work, but still capable of putting in a full day's labor. His eyes found Eleanor through the window, and Thomas saw him nod slightly, a gesture that in Jake's economy of movement conveyed both acknowledgement and approval. Jake Morrison, Thomas said as they stepped onto the porch. This is Miss Eleanor Hayes. Jake touched his hat brim with the same respectful gesture he would have offered any lady, but his greeting carried an additional note of welcome that Thomas recognized as genuine. Miss Hayes, hope the journey was not too taxing. Not at all, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for asking. Eleanor's response was warm but not effusive, striking exactly the right tone for addressing a man who valued sincerity over charm. Jake takes care of most of the day-to-day work with the livestock, Thomas explained. Knows more about cattle than anyone in the territory. Jake's weathered face showed the slightest hint of amusement at Thomas's praise, but he simply nodded and turned his attention back to Eleanor. If you need anything while Thomas is out working, you just holler. House has a good view of most of the ranch, so someone will hear you. The casual inclusion of Eleanor in the ranch's daily operations pleased Thomas, and he noticed that Eleanor seemed to understand the significance of Jake's easy acceptance. She thanked him with the same straightforward manner that had characterized all her interactions, and Jake tipped his hat again before heading back to his horse. He seems like a good man to have around, Eleanor observed as Jake rode toward the barn. The best. Came to work for me during a particularly bad winter and stayed on when things improved. I trust his judgment completely. Thomas realized as he spoke that Jake's immediate acceptance of Eleanor felt like a positive omen, though he was not typically inclined toward superstition. As evening approached, Thomas found himself uncertain about the social expectations of their first day together. Eleanor had spent the afternoon settling into her room and familiarizing herself with the kitchen, moving about the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who preferred action to conversation when adjusting to new circumstances. I usually eat supper around 6, Thomas said, feeling awkward about the mundane nature of the information. Nothing fancy, but I can handle basic cooking. I would be happy to prepare the meal, Eleanor replied. It would help me learn where everything is kept, and I enjoy cooking when I have good ingredients to work with. Thomas showed her the pantry and root cellar, both well-stocked for the coming winter, and watched as Eleanor examined the supplies with the same thorough attention she brought to everything else. She seemed pleased with the quality of the preserved vegetables and the variety of dried goods, making mental notes about what she had to work with. The meal she prepared was simple but expertly executed. Pot roast with vegetables and fresh bread that she somehow managed to produce despite never having used Thomas's stove before. They ate in a companionable silence that felt natural rather than awkward, and Thomas found himself relaxing in a way he had not expected. The bread is excellent, he said, meaning it completely. I have not tasted anything like it since I left home. My mother's recipe. She always said that good bread was the foundation of a good meal, and I think she was right. Eleanor's voice carried a note of fondness when she mentioned her mother, and Thomas filed away the information, understanding that family memories were likely both precious and painful for someone who had left everything familiar behind. After supper, they sat on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that seemed to stretch forever. Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill, but she made no move to go inside, apparently content to watch the day fade into night. It is very quiet, she said eventually, but her tone suggested observation rather than complaint. Takes some getting used to if you are accustomed to city sounds, Thomas acknowledged. But I find I sleep better with nothing but wind and night birds for company. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. I think I will too. There is something restful about silence that has space to breathe, rather than silence that feels pressed down by walls and neighbors. The observation showed such understanding of the difference between solitude and isolation that Thomas felt a flicker of hope that perhaps Eleanor Hayes might indeed find something to value in the life he had built. They sat in comfortable quiet as the first stars appeared, and Thomas found himself thinking that this was the first evening in years when the porch had felt like more than just a place to stand and look at the land. Over the following days, Eleanor settled into the rhythms of ranch life with an adaptability that surprised Thomas. She rose early without complaint, prepared breakfast while he tended to the morning chores, and spent her days learning the particular requirements of keeping house in a place where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away and the nearest store was 20. But it was not simply her domestic competence that impressed Thomas. Eleanor approached everything with the same thoughtful attention she had shown from the beginning, asking questions that revealed genuine interest in understanding rather than polite curiosity. She wanted to know why Thomas chose certain pastures for the cattle at different times of year, how he predicted the weather patterns that could make the difference between a successful season and a difficult one, what signs told him when a horse was developing lameness before it became obvious to the casual observer. "You see the land like you are reading a book," she said one morning as they stood watching the cattle spread across a hillside pasture. "All those details that look random to me have meaning for you." Thomas had never thought of his knowledge in those terms, but Eleanor's comparison felt accurate. "I suppose when you spend enough time with something, you start to notice patterns. The land tells you what it needs if you pay attention. People are like that, too," Eleanor said quietly, and Thomas glanced at her, wondering if she was speaking generally or making a more specific point about their own situation. As the days passed, Thomas found himself looking forward to the conversations that developed naturally around the practical business of daily life. Eleanor had opinions about things he had never thought to consider, and she expressed them with a directness that he found refreshing after years of dealing with people who said what they thought he wanted to hear rather than what they actually believed. When an early November storm brought the first significant snow of the season, Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Thomas and Jake worked to bring the horses into the barn and check on the cattle in the nearer pastures. The wind drove snow horizontally across the yard, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of 2 hours. "Is this typical for this time of year?" Eleanor asked when Thomas stamped into the kitchen, shaking snow from his coat and hat. "Earlier than usual, but not unheard of. Weather here can change faster than you might expect coming from the east." Thomas accepted the cup of hot coffee Eleanor handed him, grateful for the warmth after 2 hours in the wind. "Jake said you would probably need to ride out to check the herd in the south pasture," Eleanor said, and Thomas nodded, surprised that she had already learned to anticipate the requirements of weather emergencies. "Probably will not be back until after dark. Storm like this, cattle sometimes drift with the wind and end up in places where they can get into trouble." Thomas hesitated, uncertain whether Eleanor would worry about him being out in dangerous conditions or simply accept it as part of ranch life. "I will keep supper warm," Eleanor said simply, and Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. She did not ask unnecessary questions about the dangers or express anxiety that would only add to his concerns. Instead, she acknowledged what needed to be done and let him know she would be there when he returned. The ride to the south pasture was brutal, with snow stinging Thomas's face and the wind making it difficult for his horse to maintain footing on the increasingly slippery ground. But he found the cattle huddled in a grove of trees where they were partially sheltered, and after a count to make sure none had wandered off, he was able to head back toward the ranch with the satisfaction of knowing his animals were as safe as they could be under the circumstances. The lights from the house windows were visible long before Thomas reached the yard, golden squares of warmth in the white darkness of the storm, and for the first time in 15 years, the sight meant something more than simple shelter. Someone was waiting for him, someone who understood that his late return was not neglect but necessity, someone who would have kept the fire burning and the food warm because that was what partners did for each other. Eleanor met him at the door with dry clothes and hot food, and Thomas realized that this was what he had been hoping for during all those months of letters, this sense of being part of something larger than his own survival. Not dramatic declarations of love or overwhelming emotion, but the steady recognition that they were building something together, one ordinary day at a time. "Everything all right with the cattle?" Eleanor asked as Thomas settled at the kitchen table with a plate of stew that tasted like the best meal he had eaten in years. "Fine. Smarter than people sometimes about finding shelter." Thomas looked across the table at Eleanor, who was mending one of his shirts by lamplight, her needle moving with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. "Thank you for waiting up. Where else would I be?" Eleanor's response was matter-of-fact, but Thomas heard in it an acceptance of partnership that went beyond the formal arrangements they had made through letters. As winter deepened, the forced intimacy of being snowed in together for days at a time revealed aspects of each other's character that no amount of correspondence could have conveyed. Thomas discovered that Eleanor had a quiet sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments, usually when she was pointing out some absurdity in his bachelor habits that he had never noticed. Eleanor learned that Thomas had a gentleness with injured animals that contrasted sharply with his reputation as a hard man to do business with, and she began to understand that his silence often masked thoughtfulness rather than indifference. One particularly cold evening in December, as they sat by the fire after supper, Eleanor looked up from the book she was reading and found Thomas watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting the book aside. Thomas considered his words carefully, aware that they were approaching territory that neither of them had addressed directly since her arrival. "I was thinking about how different this winter feels from the others I have spent here." "Different how?" "Less like enduring something and more like living through it." Thomas struggled to articulate the change without sounding sentimental or presumptuous. "I suppose what I mean is that having someone to share it with changes the nature of the experience." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and Thomas worried that he had overstepped some boundary they had maintained through their careful politeness. But when she spoke, her words carried the same honesty that had characterized her letters. I feel the same way, not just about the winter, but about everything here. I came expecting to trade one kind of loneliness for another, something more comfortable perhaps, but not necessarily more fulfilling. Instead, I find myself feeling useful in ways I never did before. Useful how? Eleanor gestured around the room, which had gradually taken on touches of her presence without losing its essential character. Not just keeping house, though that is part of it, but feeling like what I do matters to someone, like my opinions are worth hearing, like I am contributing to something that belongs to both of us rather than just helping someone else with their life. The conversation represented a turning point in their relationship, an acknowledgement that what had begun as a practical arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had fully anticipated. They did not speak of love, which seemed too large and uncertain a word for what they were building, but they began to speak of the future in terms that included both of them as equal partners. Spring arrived gradually, as it always did in Montana, with days that alternated between winter's last struggles and hints of the warmth to come. Eleanor had suggested putting in a larger garden than Thomas typically planted, and she spent hours planning what vegetables would grow best in the high altitude and short growing season. I have never grown food before, she admitted as they worked together to prepare the soil. In Pennsylvania, I bought everything at the market. But I like the idea of eating what we have grown ourselves. Thomas found Eleanor's enthusiasm for learning new skills infectious, and he began to see his own knowledge through her eyes, recognizing the value of experience he had taken for granted. Teaching Eleanor to recognize the signs of a horse's mood or the best techniques for preserving vegetables gave him a different kind of satisfaction than simply getting the work done himself. As the garden grew and the cattle grew fat on spring grass, Thomas and Eleanor developed routines that felt natural rather than negotiated. They worked together when 4 hands were better than 2, and independently when each had separate responsibilities, but always with the awareness that they were part of a shared enterprise. The changes in their relationship were subtle but unmistakable. Thomas found himself reaching for Eleanor's hand as they walked back from checking the garden in the evening, and Eleanor began leaving small gestures of care in Thomas's daily life, mending clothes before he realized they needed it, preparing his favorite foods without being asked, making sure his coffee was ready when he came in from the morning chores. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind mountains that had lost their snow to reveal the green of early summer, Eleanor turned to Thomas with a directness that had become familiar. "Thomas, may I ask you something that has been on my mind?" "Of course. When you wrote that first letter, were you looking for a wife or a housekeeper?" Thomas considered the question seriously, understanding that Eleanor deserved an honest answer even if it revealed his own confusion about what he had wanted. "I thought I was looking for a wife, but I realize now that I did not really understand what that meant. I knew I wanted companionship, someone to share the work and the rewards of this life, but I had never experienced the kind of partnership that makes 2 people stronger together than they are separately." And now, Thomas looked at Eleanor, taking in the changes that months of ranch life had brought to her appearance and bearing. The eastern pallor had been replaced by a healthy glow from outdoor work, and the careful composure of their early days had relaxed into something more natural and confident. But the greatest change was in her eyes, which now held a contentment that had been missing when she first stepped off the train. "Now I think I am beginning to understand the difference between having someone in your life and sharing your life with someone," Thomas said. "The first is about convenience and comfort. The second is about building something together that neither of you could create alone." Eleanor smiled, and Thomas saw in her expression the same recognition that he felt. They had moved beyond the careful negotiations of their early months into something that felt both stable and full of possibility. "I have something to tell you," Eleanor said, and Thomas felt a moment of anxiety before she continued. "I wrote to my friend Martha in Pennsylvania last week, and I told her that I had found something here that I did not know I was looking for." "What was that?" "A place where I fit. Not because I changed myself to match what was expected, but because who I actually am turns out to be exactly what was needed." Eleanor paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I think that is the difference between settling for someone and choosing someone. When you settle, you compromise pieces of yourself. When you choose, you discover pieces of yourself." Thomas felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for months, a sense of completeness that he had not realized was missing until it arrived. He reached for Eleanor's hand, finding it warm and steady in his own. "Eleanor, I need you to know that what we have built together means more to me than I know how to express. If you are willing, I would like us to make it official, not because we need a ceremony to prove what we already know, but because I want the world to recognize what I see every day." Eleanor's smile was answer enough, but she spoke anyway, her voice carrying the certainty that had drawn Thomas to her letters in the first place. "Yes, Thomas, I would like that very much. This place, this life, this partnership we have created, it feels like the home I have been looking for all my life without knowing what I was seeking." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas and Eleanor sat together on their porch, hands linked, watching their land settle into the peaceful quiet of evening. Tomorrow would bring the usual work of the ranch, the endless cycle of caring for animals and crops and buildings that made frontier life possible. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious, a love that had grown not from passion or desperation, but from the daily choice to see and value each other truly. The wind carried the scent of new grass and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night, and Thomas realized that the loneliness that had been his companion for so many years had been replaced by something infinitely better. The deep satisfaction of sharing life with someone who understood that the best partnerships are built on respect, trust, and the recognition that love is not something you fall into but something you choose to create, one ordinary day at a time.